You ever catch yourself talking to yourself in a way that makes you stop and think, wait, where is this coming from? That quiet voice, full of frustration, fear, or even fury, it's not random. Sometimes the way we speak to ourselves reflects a world so heavy with injustice, it starts to echo inside us. Let's talk about that. There is a conversation that takes place beyond public spaces, away from microphones and platforms, in the most sacred chamber of our lives, the one between our soul and ourself. It is not rehearsed, it is not performed, it is raw, it is honest, and more often than not, it is the only place where the full truth of who we are and what we believe comes to the surface. When I speak to myself in this way, in the quiet aftermath of the noise, in the stillness that surrounds the early morning hours or the late night moments of solitude, I realize how much weight these inner words carry. Self-talk is not small talk. It is the blueprint of our conscience, and when that inner voice begins to whisper discomfort, sorrow, or deep unrest in response to what we witness in the world, it is not just emotion, it is revelation. There is a danger in silencing that voice, a cost in brushing it off, because that voice is the compass of our morality. It is the divine mechanism that signals to us when something is off, and when it comes to injustice, when it comes to suffering, oppression, and cruelty, that voice becomes louder, sharper, and more persistent. But we have become very good at drowning it out. We turn up the volume on distraction, we amplify the voices that tell us it's too complex, too far away, not our issue. We scroll, we swipe, we rationalize, and all the while our conscience is trying to interrupt us. When I witness pain in the world, especially pain that has been allowed, ignored, or justified, something in me shifts, something in me speaks. It doesn't need to be explained to me in political terms. I don't need to attend a seminar to understand that the bombing of a child's home, the destruction of a people's land, or the denial of someone's right to live in safety and dignity is wrong. I know it in my bones. And that knowledge doesn't come from news reports. It doesn't come from headlines or heated panels on television. It comes from the core of my being. It comes from that internal voice that only speaks when the rest of the world has gone quiet. That is the sacred power of self-talk. Not the surface-level affirmations or self-improvement mantras, but the deep, transformative reflections that hold us accountable, the kind that stares us in the face and says, "Are you really okay with this?" The kind that doesn't let us pretend not to see, the kind that dares us to question not just the world, but our own role in it. How did I stay silent? How did I excuse it? How did I benefit from it? This voice becomes even more powerful when we face collective suffering, when an entire people, such as the Palestinians, are dehumanized, displaced, and vilified. That internal dialogue becomes a site of spiritual resistance, because even when the world loses its sense of direction, your soul knows what truth feels like. Your conscience does not need to be told what injustice looks like. It feels it, it grieves it, and when we let that grief speak, when we allow ourselves to feel instead of deflect, we align with a force far greater than ourselves. But that alignment is not comfortable. It never is. Speaking to yourself with truth, especially in a world conditioned for denial, is one of the hardest things you'll ever do, because it demands change. It demands you see clearly what you wish you hadn't seen. It demands you admit that some of what you accepted, tolerated, or overlooked was never acceptable. It demands courage to unlearn, to speak up, and to stand differently. And here's the reality: oppression does not only crush the oppressed, it deforms the soul of the silent. It corrodes our ability to feel, to connect, to act. When we allow ourselves to become numb to suffering, we are not protecting our peace, we are abandoning our purpose. The soul doesn't exist to stay neutral in the face of evil, it exists to recognize it, confront it, and resist it. That process begins not in public, but in private. It begins in the sacred space where we speak to ourselves. The concept of divine accountability. There are truths that live beneath the surface of every civilization, every society, and every soul. One of those truths is the idea that nothing in this life goes unseen, that no matter how powerful someone becomes, no matter how deeply injustice is buried beneath bureaucracy, or how expertly cruelty is disguised as policy, there is a watching force, a witnessing order beyond human judgment. The concept of divine accountability is not just a religious teaching, it is a spiritual framework that insists the oppressed are never truly forgotten, and the oppressor is never truly free. In the heart of this truth is the understanding that what we do, how we treat others, especially the vulnerable, especially those stripped of voice and land, does not just exist within the bounds of history or law, it exists within the moral memory of the universe, and eventually, there is a response, a correction, a reckoning. That's not vengeance, that's not spite, that's justice at a level that transcends institutions and courts, because there comes a point when the cries of the wronged reach higher than any courtroom, and louder than any protest, and when they do, a shift occurs, whether we recognize it or not. Divine accountability means we are never acting in isolation, even when the world turns its eyes away, even when no one is left to document the truth or tell the story. That higher order sees all. It listens when children cry out from beneath rubble. It hears the prayers of mothers who bury their sons too soon. It watches as neighborhoods are erased and rewritten to suit the interests of the powerful. It does not need headlines to confirm what happened. It doesn't need footage to validate the pain. It was there, present, recording every act, every intention, every silence. This is a terrifying thought to those who build their comfort on the backs of others, to those who think they can script the world to match their narrative, but to the ones suffering, to the ones whose dignity is stolen, whose freedom is denied, whose humanity is questioned, this is hope, because if divine accountability is real, then no injustice is final, no wound is ignored, no loss is invisible, and that changes everything. But this kind of accountability doesn't always come swiftly. Sometimes it waits. It allows time for repentance, for change, for awakening. It offers mercy in place of wrath, not because it condones evil, but because it leaves room for transformation. Yet when that mercy is mocked, when it is used as a shield to continue acts of domination and cruelty, then comes the fall, and the fall doesn't always look like thunder. Sometimes it's slow, almost imperceptible at first, a disintegration of unity, a breakdown of peace, a collapse from the inside out. That's the quiet fire of divine response, not always loud, but always certain. This accountability extends beyond individuals. It stretches across nations, across regimes, across legacies. History is filled with examples, those who thought their power would last forever, only to be reduced to ruins, not by war, not by revolt, but by the weight of their own injustice catching up with them. There is no fortress strong enough to guard against moral consequence. There is no wall thick enough to keep divine truth from seeping through. When injustice becomes the foundation of a nation's identity, that nation begins to rot, not from without, but from within. And in this moment, this specific moment we're living through, there are signs. The fire is falling, not just in the form of literal destruction, but in the spiritual unraveling of those who cannot hide behind their justifications anymore. When people start speaking out who once stayed silent, when even those on the inside start to question, when those benefiting from the structure begin to weep for its victims, that is the ripple of divine accountability. It begins in the human heart, and it spreads outward. It doesn't ask for permission, it doesn't wait for approval, it moves through conscience, through history, through spirit, through consequence. This is not punishment in the way we often think of it, it is exposure, it is truth stepping forward without disguise, and once that process begins, there is no going back, because what has been seen cannot be unseen, what has been done must be answered for, and the only real question is whether we will humble ourselves before that truth, or be broken by it. The spiritual weight of injustice. Injustice is not just a social problem, it is not merely a legal issue to be debated, voted on or negotiated in diplomatic circles. Injustice, when sustained and systemic, carries a spiritual weight that settles over both the victim and the perpetrator, and it leaves an imprint on the soul of humanity itself. We often speak about war in terms of strategy, we discuss occupation through political language, we examine suffering with data, analysis, and sterile terminology, but all the while, something far deeper is happening, something sacred is being violated, the spirit of justice is being crushed under the machinery of human greed, arrogance, and indifference. There is a soul to every society, a moral and spiritual center, that determines whether it thrives in peace, or slowly disintegrates under the burden of its own wrongdoings. That soul is shaped by how it treats its most vulnerable, its most voiceless, its most marginalized. When people are systematically stripped of their homes, when they are denied the right to move freely, to live without fear, to worship, to exist with dignity, there is a rupture in the spiritual fabric of the world. These are not just violations of international law, these are wounds in the sacred trust between humanity and the divine order of justice. And what makes this so heavy, what gives injustice such an unbearable spiritual weight, is not only the act itself, but the way it is sustained through collective silence, rationalization, and willful ignorance. Every time someone justifies the oppression of a people because of fear, superiority, or historical trauma, that weight deepens. Every time a government spins suffering into strategy, or media flattens pain into politics, the soul of the world grows darker, heavier, more fragile. This is not abstract, it is real. It is felt in the bones of those who live under the shadow of drones, in the broken spirit of a grandmother walking past the ruins of her village, in the eyes of a child who doesn't know what it means to grow up without checkpoints or sirens, or the sound of walls closing in. There is no way to oppress without also being spiritually diminished by the act. The very effort it takes to deny another human being their full humanity requires the oppressor to sever something in themselves. You cannot build walls without also building fear. You cannot erase a culture without also erasing a part of your own soul. You cannot bomb neighborhoods and claim moral high ground in the same breath. That contradiction, that violence, creates a fracture in the spirit, and no amount of military might or political power can mend what the heart refuses to acknowledge. The spiritual weight of injustice also presses upon those who choose to look away. Neutrality, in moments of moral crisis, is not innocent, it is a quiet form of betrayal. The soul of the bystander is not exempt from the consequences of silence. Compassion that does not extend to the oppressed is not compassion at all, it is sentiment masquerading as virtue, and in the face of generational suffering, like the kind endured by the people of Palestine, this failure to stand for truth becomes part of the injustice itself. There are places in the world where injustice becomes so normalized, so institutionalized, that people forget how unnatural it truly is, but the spirit never forgets. The land remembers, the ancestors remember, and the cries of the oppressed are carried into the heavens, heavy with the weight of centuries. That weight doesn't vanish with time, it accumulates, it thickens the air, it slows the heartbeat of a civilization, it leads to disconnection, despair, and eventually collapse, not just politically, but spiritually. We are often told to be careful not to judge what we don't fully understand, but there are moments when we don't need perfect understanding to know when a people are being crushed. We don't need to be scholars of geopolitics to recognize the face of suffering. There is a wisdom in the soul that rises up in the presence of injustice. It trembles, it grieves, it mourns even when the mind is still trying to catch up. That is the sacred indicator of truth. When your soul responds before your intellect does, that's when you know the weight has entered the room. The burden of injustice is not only carried by those who endure it, it is shared by all who witness, and all who remain unmoved. Empathy and awakening. Empathy is not a soft word, it is not passive, It is not a luxury reserved for quiet moments of reflection. Empathy is one of the most powerful disruptive forces we possess, because it demands that we feel what is not happening to us. It is a radical act of spiritual alignment, a choice to enter the pain of another, not to fix it, not to control it, but to witness it without turning away. In a world structured to desensitize, to distract, to divide, empathy is an awakening. It is what begins the unraveling of indifference. It is what softens the heart enough for truth to enter. We are taught, sometimes directly and sometimes subtly, that empathy should be earned, that people must fit into our framework of innocence before we extend our compassion, that suffering must be qualified, justified, explained, or politically convenient before we allow ourselves to feel for the other. But that is not empathy, that is conditional concern. Empathy in its truest form breaks down walls, it steps across borders, it refuses to let labels, narratives, or ideologies numb the raw truth of human suffering. There is a moment, and it often comes quietly, when empathy shatters the illusion, when the story we've been told, or the story we've told ourselves, no longer holds under the weight of reality. You see the face of a child pulled from rubble, you hear the grief of a mother who has buried her third son, you witness the aching, ordinary humanity of people who have lived decades under siege, under silence, under occupation, and something in you awakens. It's not just sadness, it's not guilt, it is a reckoning, a voice inside that says, if this were me, if this were my family, if this were my home, what would I want the world to do? That moment of awakening is dangerous to systems of control, because when people begin to feel deeply, they begin to see clearly. When empathy enters the heart, it becomes almost impossible to accept the lies that sustain oppression. You begin to question everything. Why are we told to be afraid of those we've never met? Why are victims framed as threats? Why is the narrative so quick to erase the humanity of the suffering? You start to see not just the people in pain, but the machinery that keeps that pain invisible, manageable, ignorable. Empathy is disruptive, because it leads to moral clarity, and moral clarity does not sit comfortably inside the boundaries of convenience. Once you truly see the pain of another, once you let that truth pierce your heart, you cannot go back, you cannot unsee what you've seen, you cannot unfeel what you've felt. That is awakening, and awakening is a threat to the comfortable, the complicit, and the controlling, but it is also a gift, because empathy doesn't just connect us to the suffering, it connects us to the sacred. It reminds us of our shared fragility, our shared breath, our shared longing for safety, for dignity, for home. Empathy cracks open the illusion of separation. It reveals that what we do to another, we do to ourselves. What we deny another, we deny within. When we allow an entire people to be dehumanized, we slowly lose our own humanity in the process. And when we choose to feel again, to truly feel, we begin to recover what was lost. This recovery doesn't require perfection, it doesn't require knowing all the facts, quoting every statistic, or winning every debate. It requires presence, it requires being honest enough to say, I didn't understand before, but I'm beginning to see now. It requires listening to those whose voices have been drowned out by propaganda and prejudice. It requires humility, the kind of humility that says, maybe I've been wrong, maybe I've been silent for too long, maybe I have more to learn than I thought. Empathy is not weakness, it is courage, it is resistance, it is how the soul protests in a world that rewards apathy. When you allow your heart to be broken by the suffering of others, you are not being emotional, you are being awake, you are placing your humanity on the line, you are saying, I refuse to look away, and in doing so, you join a long tradition of those who dared to feel deeply in times when numbness was safer. The fire that falls, a spiritual metaphor for collapse. There are moments in history when the consequences of oppression, arrogance and moral blindness do not arrive in whispers, they come roaring like fire, not always the kind of fire that burns buildings or scorches land, but a fire that consumes from within. It is spiritual first, then emotional, and eventually societal. This fire is not always visible, but it is undeniable. It is the fire that falls, when the weight of injustice becomes too heavy to bear, when the cry of the oppressed becomes too loud to silence, and when the moral fabric of a people, a nation, or an empire, begins to unravel under the burden of what it has ignored, excused or inflicted. This fire does not discriminate by geography or by politics. It is not interested in who claims to be civilized or who controls the narrative. It falls according to a deeper law, one that is not written by human hands, but etched into the architecture of existence itself. There is only so much suffering a society can inflict before that suffering demands response. There is only so long a people can cry out in agony before their tears begin to set the world ablaze, not just metaphorically, but spiritually, because suffering, when prolonged and unanswered, gathers power. It becomes a sacred force, and when that force breaks through, it does not ask permission. The fire that falls is a message. It is a disruption. It is the divine rejection of cruelty normalized and wrongs institutionalized. It exposes the structures built on lies. It reveals the rot hidden beneath polished surfaces, and it consumes not only what was built unjustly, but also what stood silently beside that injustice. Silence, after all, is not neutral. It is fuel. Every unspoken truth, every averted gaze, every comfortable denial, these are the dry twigs that feed the fire when it comes. And when that fire begins to fall, it is not just a moment of destruction, it is a moment of truth. The truth that the world cannot keep turning the same way. The truth that what was sustainable for the oppressor was unbearable for the oppressed. The truth that the illusion of order was always covering chaos. This is not new. It has happened before. Empires have crumbled under the weight of their own cruelty. Nations have collapsed not because they lacked power, but because they lacked mercy. The fall comes not when the enemy is strong, but when the spirit of the nation becomes sick, hollow, and exhausted by its own falsehoods. The fire falling is a call to wake up, to look around and see what has been tolerated for far too long. It is the sound of the divine saying, "Enough, enough of the bombs. Enough of the lies, enough of the dehumanization, enough of the rewriting of suffering to make it sound justified, enough of building peace for one people at the expense of another's extinction, enough of using history as a shield to repeat its darkest chapters." When the fire falls, it brings everything into the light. There is no more hiding, no more spinning, no more pretending. And yet, the fire is not just wrath, it is revelation. It reveals what we refuse to see. It ignites the conscience. It forces questions we were too afraid to ask. What kind of world have we built? What kind of soul have we protected? What have we allowed in the name of safety, of power, of heritage? These questions burn, because they're supposed to. They're meant to purify, not just punish, meant to awaken, not just destroy. The fire clears what no longer serves life, love, or justice. It opens space for something new. If we are willing to surrender what is broken, this is where the metaphor meets reality. When a nation refuses to see its role in another people's suffering, when it cloaks its violence in righteousness, when it silences dissent with fear and force, there comes a time when its moral center begins to decay. You can hold territory with might, but you cannot hold the soul of a people with missiles. You can control a narrative with media, but you cannot control the divine memory of justice. The fire doesn't just fall to destroy, it falls to remind us that justice is not a choice. It is an obligation written into the laws of the universe, into the bones of the earth, into the breath of the oppressed who still, somehow, have the courage to hope. Conclusion: there are moments in human history when silence becomes betrayal, when neutrality is not an option, and when the soul itself begins to ache under the weight of injustice. This is one of those moments. What we've explored is not just a political issue or a religious conflict, it is a deeply spiritual reckoning, a confrontation with the truth that how we treat the most vulnerable among us defines who we really are. When fire falls, not just from the sky, but from the heavens, it signals that the balance has been broken, that the sacred has been violated, and that the consequences can no longer be delayed. This is not about assigning blame, nor is it a call for vengeance. It is a plea for awakening, a call to every conscience still beating, to every heart still capable of compassion, to rise, to speak, to refuse to participate in the dehumanization of any people. to understand that divine accountability is not reserved for some far-off day of judgment. It is happening now, in the way hearts are turning, in the way systems are shaking, in the way illusions are crumbling. This is the moment to choose. Will we be among those who clung to comfort while others cried for justice, or will we be among those who, even in the face of fear, chose to stand on the side of truth? Because when the fire falls, it does not simply punish, it purifies. It strips away the lies we told to survive in systems that never served us. It reveals the sacred power of empathy, the transformative force of bearing witness, and the unshakable law that what is done to the least among us is done to us all. Let this not be the end of a conversation, but the beginning of a deeper return to truth, to justice, to the very heart of our humanity.